So you'll let me know when it's live stream, or you want me to tell you? Starting when?
They wanted to do it 10 minutes beforehand.
Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. I'd like to get started, and apparently learning now that the live stream starts at 10 minutes before the meeting. So while your mics won't be hot, your actions will. So please comport yourself accordingly. So just know that, and as I've stated earlier, we have new mics. They're very sensitive. So please understand any sidebars will also and can also be picked up and memorialized for eternity. With that being said, thank you everybody for coming. We're going to have our remarks from the PSC about co-location and the CPCN process. We have Fred Hoover. Kumar, is he not here?
He's not here. Sorry.
He's always been scared to come to ECM. Please make sure you take that message back to him that his heart has been again exposed.
Okay.
Bonnie Schushman,
yeah.
Morris Shrem, Benjamin Baker, and Sophie McDonald.
Right, and also Commissioner Mike Rich.
Sorry, Commissioner, I missed you.
That's fine.
So if we can go ahead and get started, that'd be great.
Chair Wilson, Vice Chair Crosby, members of the Economic Matters Committee. I'm Fred Hoover. I'm the Chair of the Maryland Public Service Commission, and we're glad to be here to discuss a couple of important topics that you're going to be dealing with this session. One, this issue of co-location, and then secondly, the siting of energy facilities. As was mentioned, I have with me two of the four commissioners that serve on the Public Service Commission, Bonnie Sushman and Mike Richard. Commissioner Barve is unfortunately under the weather, couldn't be here. And Commissioner O'Donnell retired earlier, and they have not made an appointment to that vacancy yet. And then at the ends of the table is Commission Advisors Ben Baker and Morris Shrem, who help work with the commissioners on making the decisions that we make. In December, we filed a report that was requested by the General Assembly as a result of the passage of Senate Bill 1, asking us to offer our thoughts and recommendations on the issue of co-location of certain types of loads on the existing system. And just so we know what we're talking about, we distributed a slide deck which summarizes the findings that we made in the report. And if you could look at slide 4, that's titled Defining Terminology, it'll help explain the two types of co-location that we've talked about in the report. Type A is sort of the normal process for integrating a large energy user into the current system. So a large business would apply to the local utility to be incorporated into their distribution system. And once that became part of that, then it gets passed up to PJM, which is the grid that oversees the electricity supply in the state of Maryland and surrounding states. And so in our report, we referred to this as type A co-location, where the load is treated as PJM network load. It's the traditional method of adding load to the PJM electric grid. It interconnects with the grid and gets services from the local distribution company. It's part of PJM's tariffs. It's that demand that's going to be expected from that large user is put into PJM's planning process when they set up the needs they have for electricity. and then the costs that they impose on the system are allocated under the current process. Type B is this more novel idea of co-location that was talked about last session, where literally the large energy user directly connects to a generation source, a power plant of some sort. And the idea is that this would be they would essentially buy the output from that generation plant, and that generation plant, since it's supplying this one customer, would no longer be supplying electricity to the PJM grid. And that load is not counted, since it has this direct connection to a generation facility. That load is not counted in part of the PJM planning process, nor are the normal cost allocation rules applied to that. So essentially, this would be a purchase power agreement between the large energy user, hypothetically a data center, and the generation facility. And so we were asked to examine this potential concept and offer suggestions on it, and our report, as I mentioned, was filed in December. The report focuses on the emerging co-location arrangement in which the load co-locates with a generator that is connected to the grid, but the connection is behind the generator's meter. And so under this arrangement, the load would offtake electricity directly from the generation facility instead of being connected to the grid. And in fact, the way this process is described is that there would be barriers put so that they actually couldn't access electricity from the grid because they have this direct connection. It is our conclusion that this type of co-location could present significant risk to reliability to Maryland and the PJM region, where the non-network load, the type B type of load, connects to the generation system. It's considered actually to be off system or literally off the grid. Hypothetically, if this type of energy user was directly connected to a plant, hypothetically the Calvert Cliffs plant down in southern Maryland, the output from that power plant would no longer be available to the PJM grid because it would now have this direct connection with this particular customer. And it's our concern that this type of arrangement could accelerate the resource adequacy concerns that we've already seen in the state and in the PJM region. It's also our concern that the cost impacts of a large co-locating load in a non-network configuration with existing generation has the potential to be more impactful on the prices and the supply of electricity for the Maryland region. Now, there's a distinct possibility that this type of arrangement could be very attractive to a very large user and also attractive to the generation facility. Because right now, the way it works is the makers of electricity, the generation plants, whether they're fossil fuel plants or renewable resources, bid into the PJM market. And so PJM describes how much electricity they're going to need, and they have what's known as the capacity auction. And the people who make electricity, they offer their electricity to the PJM system, and the PJM system then decides how much electricity they need, what's the right price, and make that arrangement to provide electricity to the grid. In this situation, the generation facility would have a direct contractual arrangement with a large user. And so for them, it gives them the certainty of the fact that their supply is going to be used and paid for. And for the facility that uses a lot of electricity, they get the guarantee that they have a dedicated source of electricity. But our concern is that this arrangement, while it works well for the large user and may work well for the generation facilities, has very significant impacts on the overall grid. So this could, in fact, lead to a situation where significant quantities of load are moved out of the PJM system and are dedicated to one particular resource. And this is particularly an acute concern now because of the fact that for a variety of reasons, electricity demand has been increasing. And so the use of these large, significant loads in a situation where they have a dedicated source of electricity that previously had been used to supply electricity to the whole grid is a concern that we think has significant impacts, could have significant impacts on the reliability and the prices of electricity in the state of Maryland. And while we have not specifically recommended that this arrangement be made illegal, we do have recommendations in the report we filed with you to clarify certain portions of the public utility article regarding both what is considered to be a retail electric customer, so that these large loads actually would be considered that under the Maryland law, and it would allow us the ability to make decisions about how this sort of process should be integrated into the electric system, and also make clear that we could make sure that this customer pays this part of the burden of maintaining the overall grid. We also make recommendations about changing the definitions about what a energy supplier is to make it clear again that these things can work in here. The bottom line on this is that this is a novel approach to connecting load to the grids. And if the state decides that data centers are integral to the new digital economy and the economic benefits of allowing these facilities to locate in the state of Maryland is something that we need to do in order to maintain the economic viability of the state, then the elected leadership working with us will need to figure out a way to incorporate these facilities into the current system without causing threats to the existing energy infrastructure of the state and the existing customers. And so I'm sure you have a number of questions, so I kind of wanted to hold off on extensive remarks on that, and we are available to answer any questions you have.
Delegate Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Chairman Hoover, so I'm looking at slide 2, and I guess you were sort of talking about the potential impacts to reliability of Maryland's distribution and transmission systems. Over the last year, how many times have there been a problem, and at what capacity have we had to reach back out to PJM to try to tap into their reserves, and at what cost?
Well, the way the system is set up, I mean, PJM, the current generation fleet provides enough electricity to supply the needs that we have on an everyday basis, and includes a certain amount of plants that are referred to as the reserve margin. So we never, even on the hottest days, which is when the system is stressed the most, or the flip side of that, I guess, is during the polar vortex, when literally everything is running. On most days, there's enough supply of electricity to supply all the needs of the customers for that particular day. I mean, that's the way the PJM system is set up. They, contract with the generation plants to provide the electricity that's needed on a day-to-day basis. So it's a combination of historic demand, weather, and other factors like that. So we haven't really I mean, the closest we've come to it is, I think, last summer when we had that sort of extensive heat wave. The PJM system sent out some alerts that said, look, demand is sort of getting toward the top here, and they have certain things that they do, voltage reductions and other things they do to make sure that the power goes out. But we've never had a serious situation that would have resulted in a blackout.
So, I mean, and that's a great explanation of the process, but in terms of actual usage, so like during that period of time last summer, 5 hours, 10 hours, did we have to tap into to the reserves for additional capacity here in Maryland? And what is the cost associated with that, if you could put a dollar value on it?
So there is, this does have, cost impacts, but actually it's been mainly seen not so much in the summertime situation, but in the wintertime. So the polar vortex issues that we've had over the last few years there were situations where, when they were having every power plant supply electricity, the cost obviously goes up, and the people that really got impacted by that were some of the people that were on retail energy contracts that had what was known as not a fixed price, but a variable price. And basically, you get charged whatever it costs them to acquire electricity. So in those situations, the cost to customers were very significant, so.
But not an actual dollar value. And I guess, let me try it this way, and then I'll yield. So during the summer, I'm a BGE customer, and they have these peak rewards.
Right.
And if you lower your usage during those peak rewards, you save a little money.
Right.
So the corollary to that is when they have these blackouts, we should be able to sort of kind of determine an approximate dollar value, an approximate load usage that we might need to get from the reserves. So we don't really have a number for that based on, say, like last year.
Not a specific number. It sort of becomes sort of a situational type situation.
But it's not meaningful at this point.
Well, I mean, it's meaningful in the sense that, it costs you more money, obviously, the more electricity you happen to use at particularly these high price times. And some of that is dependent upon how for your house, how you've gotten electricity. If you have it through standard offer service, those rates are sort of fixed and not subject to the same variability as it is with some of the retail suppliers that have what's known as variable rates, where essentially you pay for the cost to make electricity that particular day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Hoover. As you guys all know, we had a lot of discussion about this last year, and frankly, if you're not the gentle lady from Montgomery County, this can be French to a lot of people. So I just want to, the one sticking point that I still don't understand, just help clarify this for me. So if you have a 500 megawatt data center, right, and you say what you guys are calling type A collocation, right, so connecting to the grid as normal things do, wouldn't it have the same net impact if you're doing it, if you're co-locating with a generator? Isn't the same 500 megawatts coming online?
Well, it's the same 500 megawatts, but I think the distinction we're trying to draw is that when you're connected through the type A process, then PJM factors that new load into their power demand analysis. And so when they're contracting for power, they will now count this into it. The concern we have with the type B situation is that the 500 facility would wind up having a direct connection with an existing power plant. And so therefore, all the electricity needed to supply the data center would come from that existing power plant. So one, it's not figured into PJM's estimates of power that they need. But the other thing is that prior to that, this power plant was probably part of the PJM process of supplying electricity to everybody else with this separate contractual relationship with the data center. They're no longer part of the process. So not only is the demand gone up, but you've actually subtracted something from the supply.
So the net impact technically would be the same on the grid. I guess what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the PJM process would be different? I mean, I'm still confused.
Well, what we're saying is that, and this is from PJM itself, is they are not counting that new demand as part of the demand for the whole grid. And so this is sort of like out there, it's, using electricity, but it's not considered part of PJM's system. Again, because in PJM's mind, they have their own source of electricity. I mean, it's almost the same as, theoretically, if you could put enough panels, solar panels on the roof of the data center so that all the power it got came from those panels, it would be off the grid and nobody would care. The problem we have is that the situation that's been described here in this type B situation is that it's an existing power plant, a natural gas plant, a nuclear power plant that currently is supplying electricity to the PJM grid and to all the other customers. Under this new contractual arrangement, that plant would no longer be supplying electricity to the overall grid because now all of its electricity is going to this one facility.
Right, got it.
Sure.
So, I'm Bonnie Suchman, one of the commissioners. So you're assuming that it's a zero-sum game,
Right.
that if I could either take power from this generator that I'm co-locating with, or I can take it from the grid. But the thing about a large load coming, like you're a person who's just coming into the system. No one does a study because you don't have enough power that you're going to be drawing from the grid. But if you're a 500 megawatt facility, they're going to have to do a study because they're going to have to see how it's going to impact the distribution system. Because if you're taking power, there could be constraints on the distribution system. There may not be enough power on the grid as a whole. PJM has about a 15-16% reserve margin. They like to have that. That's their cushion. So if you take enough power from that and they lose their cushion, that's going to be a concern. Mm-hmm. Those are all things that are studied. If you're a generator, if you're a data center that takes a generator off of the system, you don't really know what the impact is going to be on the distribution system. There could be sort of unintended consequences, constraints that are caused by taking that generator off. It also may be that there's not enough generation on the system to be able to accommodate maybe that 500 megawatt data center and another 500 megawatt data center, and the PJM grid, the PJM system for bringing generation on is a very slow process. And so you could end up having constraints on the grid for several years out because you've taken that generator off the system. So energy is like water. I mean, it flows in both directions on an AC system. And when you take something away, you don't always know what the impact is going to be. And so you could end up having problems hundreds of miles away.
So
and that's why the study is so important.
Just a quick follow-up here. So essentially what you're saying is under the type B co-location, that PJM can't forecast what's happening in the future.
Well, here's where I think I'm going to put the fine point on this. So when somebody says, I want to co-locate, and this, back it up, there is no federal rules around this currently. PJM is doing one-offs, and there is currently a lot of litigation at the federal level over this exact topic to determine what are the rules of the road for what PJM will do when somebody wants to co-locate and should it be allowed. And so currently, PJM has put out guidance that says, I will study it at this specific point in time. But it's not going into their overall system study where they look at all the constraints at once. They just do this. They say, what is the state of the system at the time of the request? They study it. That is a bit simplified, but that's kind of how it was described to us during our hearing. And so it's not being studied comprehensively. We also know that PJM, when they're looking at it for if they need to fix the problem, they're going to fix it with transmission. So this discussion around generation going down is, if it goes down, PJM is going to just simply keep using the capacity markets to continue to send a price signal to get something new. And so we did find that as a weakness inside the process when they're planning for this decrementing. They're really just looking at how can I rearrange the system with existing resources to serve everything. And they're not saying, oh, well, if it went below the reserve margin, they might have some safety stuff. But really, they're just going to keep sending price signals to hopefully fix it, which then gets to, I think, we had those three things talking about impacts to the markets, impacts to reliability, impacts to ratepayers. And I think that impact to ratepayer question, which is kind of, I think where it came in, though, in this instance, is this new load is now avoiding they're locking in a price guarantee with the generator that is now the effects of their choice they're insulated from, while the other loads, us, everyone else, take the brunt of that. And so the economics would change if everyone had to play under the same rules, maybe for that co-located load. So I think when you get down to the ratepayer impact, that's where you start to actually see the bigger delta between the two. There's a lot of nuances that are happening at the wholesale level and at the transmission level that we could go back and forth on, but when you get down to it, it's the cost allocation question in terms of, is this fair or not?
Yeah, thank you. Would love to chat more offline about this.
Ben, I just want to say thank you because I obviously, I appreciate the presentation, but making sure that people understand that this is a net negative to the ratepayer. And there's really no way around it because, it's difficult to understand, and I'm sure we have more questions, but, obviously, my vice chair and I have been studying this for some time, so I really appreciate the breakdown again because it's confusing because you think if you're anywhere on the line, it's going to be the same impact, but it's going to hurt us if it's taking from Calvert Cliffs. And I wanted to make sure that, I'm glad that you made that very clear that, it's a net negative at the end of the day. Because there are going to be other questions just about data centers as a whole, the impact it has on, the regions that they're put in versus the PJM, but we'll save that for another time. Next, I believe we have Delegate Arentz.
Chair, I guess just a quick definition. You're talking about existing power sources on the PJM, is that right?
Yes.
So this B version that you're mentioning, if I were a new business coming in, you're not going to mess with that. If I could come in and generate enough clean energy or renewable energy on my own location in Maryland, you'd be okay with that?
Yeah, so what we're talking about, the concern we have with the type B situation is the new user essentially taking away an existing plant that's part of the generation fleet for PJM. So if it's a new user and they bring their own lunch, I guess is the best way to describe it. If they bring their own power so that they don't need that, then it's not a problem. Or if they incorporate as part of the PJM load, then PJM can figure out how to accommodate them along with everybody else. What we're concerned about is this specific situation that the chairman was just sort of alluding to where the user and the power facility have a direct contractual relationship.
Okay, but if the user is, let's say, Maryland's surrounded by a lot of states that don't have the aggressive views that we have on clean energy and renewable energy. If I was, say, a border property and I wanted to go to Pennsylvania, West Virginia to do the same thing, is that saying, will this prohibit that? If I wanted sole source with somebody in, say, Pennsylvania from?
Well, it would depend on, well, two things. One, I mean, as was mentioned by Ben, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the entity that regulates PJM, we don't regulate PJM, has not set up what the rules of the road are. So there may be some constraints that they put into it. But otherwise, it would apply to whatever the rules of the road are in that particular state, so West Virginia, Pennsylvania, or whatever, if they have the ability and are not concerned of the impact of having these kind of direct contractual relationships, I suppose, yeah, it could go there. But, I think, the upshot is we just need to be concerned, since data centers are such a unique load and they kind of bring a whole package of things. There's certain benefits that they provide, obviously. They appear to be a fairly important piece of the new economy, the new digital economy and things like that. They also, from what they've said, bring a certain number of jobs and a certain amount of tax revenue because of the way they locate. So they have some charms. But the flip side is they impose certain demands on the existing infrastructure. One, the electricity system, obviously because they use so much electricity, and also to a certain extent, apparently the water system, just because they need water to keep the facility at a certain temperature. So, I think going forward, all of you are going to have to balance those benefits that they theoretically provide with the burdens that they're imposing on the state by wherever they locate.
So there's one other factor, though, that should be taken into account in dealing with data centers that are completely off-grid. And of course, there is the benefit of not having line losses, not having to build out infrastructure. But there are wires charges that are put on transmission and distribution to pay for other types of programs. And they're put on the wires just because it's sort of a convenient way of making sure that everybody pays. So reliability. So the NERC, the value that we get from NERC, that's paid through billing determinants that are put on they determine the amount of usage on the system, and that's on the transmission. You take load off, you take billing determinants off, and there's going to be less money available for reliability. Empower is another program that's put on the distribution charge. So to the extent that we lose that opportunity, there may be other avenues that would need to be explored to be able to recover those costs, to be able to pay for those programs.
Thank you.
And again, as I said, while we are here talking about co-locating, I think a big issue that we have to determine in this committee is, well, the overall benefit versus the detriment of the actual data centers. And I think Fred and your panels brought some very important points of, the benefit may be to a jurisdiction, but the detriment may be to that ratepayer area, not just PJM. And I think that that's something, when it comes to extra transmission cost, because wherever you draw down, there's an expectation, well, we still needed the same amount of energy before the data center got here. How are we going to get it? And to make it clear is we have to determine that, colleagues, is the overall benefit of data centers, i.e., I guess the tax benefit, but who that goes to, because we know the ratepayer is going to take a hit, whether it's behind or in front of the meter. And again, I may be misunderstanding this, but to my review and study of this, is there is a negative implication to the ratepayer, whether it's in front of the meter or behind the meter. And I think it's up to us to balance that, what that benefit and who is actually receiving that benefit. Because I think sometimes we're being sold this very new shiny object. It may not be so shiny. So again, I appreciate the answers. Next is Elgin Harrison.
Thank you. And I think that some of my questions may have been answered, but I just want to make sure that I'm fully understanding. So I think, and this is in my opinion, that data centers are coming. How are they going to look is still yet to be determined, but we know that they require a lot of energy. So whether, and I'm saying data center because that's kind of what was alluded to with this. The data center, whether it goes in front or behind, is still going to require energy, which means that it's got to come from somewhere. And what you're saying from your report is that if it's co-located as a type B, then you're saying that it's going to take that entire transmission facility offline, so it won't be available at all to any. And does it matter what size it is?
Can I take?
Well, yeah.
So it will take off what it uses. So let's say Calvert. So let's say they want to take 500 off, and I have a 1,000 megawatt generator. Currently, these are the interim rules from PJM are the 500 megawatts that were remaining are still available for the grid to use. Those other 500 megawatts that are going to be dedicated to the load really shouldn't be impacting the markets. There's certain discussions around if they can or can't, but trying to keep this simple, we're going to assume they're off. So that other 500, yes, it is available, but the pricing impacts of removing that 500 will now impact the power prices in the region. And so the question becomes, and so the load that signed that agreement with the generator, that agreement is their cost and whatever they had to pay to interconnect, versus the region will now pay whatever the new prices are because of the loss of that 500 megawatts.
So using that same example, if it's 500
Right.
and it's on the other side, I guess that would be a type A?
Correct.
Would that be considered, that would be a type A. Does it not still pull that same amount away? And so help me to understand then why that's a better benefit than the other.
And this is where I think we're getting to, we have to kind of weigh the pros and the cons of the two arrangements, because what's going to happen in that arrangement is that generator is now part of the overall PJM market, or that load is now part of the overall PJM market, and they will share in the pricing impacts of adding themselves to the grid at that point in time. So any subsequent cost impacts to the region due to their choice to locate there, they will also share in with the remainder of the remainder of the customers in the area. So it's not that the customers in the area won't also experience a price impact of that new large load is showing up, depending on how the rest of the grid is built. But from a cost allocation perspective, that new load, that 500 megawatt data center is now also sharing in the volatility of whatever is happening in the power market that they would not have done had they co-located in the B arrangement where they were now isolated from the overall grid. So it becomes, and that becomes that trade-off, and why we talk about, well, maybe it's something where maybe there is a benefit to looking at this because you might get the jobs, but you got to kind of study the exact situation when it does arise.
So the bottom line is that hypothetically it comes, there's a loss of 500 megawatts still, but you're saying that everybody will share in the cost of it, and that's just on the ratepayer side, which we appreciate. But we still have the issue of the actual distribution, reliability, et cetera, and how I think you may have said it earlier, but I may have lost it. What then what then are the pros and cons on the type A co-location when we talk about, because you're still losing that 500.
Right, and I think if to leave today with the idea that any sort of addition has to be studied is what's so critical. So if you have the situation you were talking about of taking 500 and leaving 500, if there were constraints on the distribution grid already, then taking 500 or constraints on the transmission system to send that power to other parts of PJM, then taking that 500 could have actually relieved constraints. So we just don't know, and that's the important point of study. The other thing that data centers can offer, and this has been the case in other jurisdictions, is that they've actually you've been able to call on data centers to help with grid support during challenges, so that they could actually be a benefit to the system. That they're not just pulling power, but they could actually be supplying power, depending on the arrangement. So that there are opportunities where data centers can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem, but allowing them to just sort of co-locate without any input from us and from other regulators is I think going to create a problem that doesn't have to be created. Our engagement can ensure that customers are not impacted, but that the grid is benefited, and so there can be a win-win to data centers being part of the system, but only if we can engage in their deployment.
And that's all of that, what you just said, I think that's very important, and I'm assuming that you have that outlined in the report as well, as not just that it's all doom and gloom.
Right.
Okay.
And to
Thank
follow
you.
up on that, I mean, I don't want to leave the impression that data centers are a complete negative. I mean, the data center industry has talked about the fact that as they develop these facilities, they are looking to encourage energy development associated with their use. And so some of these are trying to create either renewable facilities that are located at the same time when they're building the data center to help augment part of the load, or the most prominent example of this is the arrangement between Microsoft and the folks that own 3 Mile Island, that they're now going to be reopening that plant that had not been operating for decades as a way of supplying new electricity. So if they, as I mentioned earlier, if the data center folks, kind of bring their lunch to the party and are incorporated into the planning process, then there's maybe less negative impact that potentially could occur from that happening. But again, it's going to depend on the rules that are created by this body, and then the rules that are created by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as to how they get integrated into the system.
Thank you. I believe next we have Delegate Charkoudian, and I mean this with all seriousness. Did you want to wait and go last? Or did you, because there's somebody in front of you, I just know you have very eye-opening and complex questions. So
There's someone in front of me?
there's somebody behind you.
Oh, I'm either. way,
No,
it's
you
fine.
go ahead. You can go there. That's fine. That's what I'm saying. I just had a feeling hers would be faster because I know you,
Go ahead,
you know a
that's
lot
fine.
about this. Just one moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, colleague. My question really is going to be very simple because I'm just trying to understand this from a general standpoint. So, because PGM is not the only U.S. data center that energy sector that we have, energy center that we have. And as was alluded to, data centers aren't going to go away. Other people are struggling with this. So my biggest question is type A and type B the primary approach that people are taking? If we would take if I were to look at areas outside of the eastern side of the U.S., is there another model that we should be thinking about? That's just a general question. Is type A and type B the general approach only?
Mr. Shrine, you want to take
We're
first?
looking at an area here where we have competitive markets and we have a division between our wires entity and the generators. And the generators, I'm sorry. Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, bad angle here, but. So we're in a place where our generators compete in a market that is run by PJM. In other parts of the country, they may be in vertically integrated utilities, so they have their public service commissions have complete control over the generation, over the distribution system, so they can control all this in one package. Well, in this case, we're kind of looking at moving parts. We have our jurisdiction over the distribution system. We give CPCNs for the generation. We have no control over the load. It shows up when it wants to. And we have the federal side that's taking a look at the transmission side and the markets. So it's a bit more complex here than it is in other areas where everything is vertically integrated in a controlled manner.
So the other models that I might see, if I read about other places, we can't do that because of the way we are already set up and the way we have compartmentalized the different.
I think it's less likely we can do something like that. And also here, because as was mentioned several times, some of this is related to the way things are happening on the federal side, and it's still up in the air.
Sure, but the other areas have that same problem too in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I would just add, Mike Richard, Commissioner, that the chairman has mentioned a couple times about the bring your own lunch method, and we saw that with Microsoft, what they're doing at the former 3 Mile Island. Now they're calling it the Crane 1 facility, nuclear facility. That's an arrangement where a company is actually bringing new new generation online and tends to work inside the PJM system. So there is that model that will, again, I think help alleviate some of the concerns we've already talked about here. From a PJM states, one of my roles is to be representative to the organization of PJM states. So this is an issue I think of importance to a number of PJM states, and that is just the fairness. And we're trying to work with PJM to come up with when they do their necessary studies, that we have some transparency and understanding what's going into those studies, to making sure that it is taking into consideration all the impacts on ratepayers, so that when you take away, it's almost like a deactivation. If you take away a certain amount, you may have some stranded cost assets because of the transmission system that was built to go into that facility. And that may also require now additional and new transmission be built elsewhere, again, to replace that. So there are a lot of different types of costs that need to be considered when the necessary study is done.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to go to Delegate Charkoudian.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for taking this year to do this work and for all your thorough work. Appreciate it. I want to see if I can summarize, if you can let me know. I'm in a somewhat simplified version, see if this kind of captures it in terms of the impact on ratepayers. I know that ratepayer impact is going to be a significant theme for us, and we need to do everything we can this year to protect ratepayers. So if this question about 500 megawatts is 500 megawatts, so why does it matter if it's in front or behind? Would it be correct to say that if you put 500 megawatts in front of the meter outside of co-location, and PJM does a study and determines that we need to build a new transmission line that's going to cost $800 million because of that new load, that would then get shared by everybody, but it would also have a significant payment from the causer of that load, which would be the data center. Do I have that correct so far?
So far, yeah, right.
And if that same 500 megawatts went in behind the meter, as FERC and PJM tariffs stand right now, and taking that load off caused the need for $800 million of transmission, that entire cost would go to ratepayers, not to the data center that just co-located. Is that correct?
So that's the concern we have. I guess I don't necessarily want to be completely definitive since, as was mentioned, this is still sort of a work in progress. So
it's a work in progress at FERC.
At FERC, yes.
So something we don't control.
Depending on what they decide, some of that cost, but the concern we have is that the situation you're describing is what will happen.
So at this point in time, before FERC rules, like as we take the next 90 days to protect ratepayers, 87 days, whatever we have left, to protect ratepayers, assuming FERC hasn't ruled by the end of that 90-day period, we need to make a decision under the current rules without knowing what they're going to do. And the current rules would suggest that that $800 million would be on our ratepayers. Is that right?
Well, and I want to just add one caveat there, because I think we're going to end up in a back and forth with individuals over this 90-day session over that statement. Is that at the time somebody says they want to co-locate, they do that study. If PJM says I need to build X amount of things to serve you, it's transmission related. The argument is that the co-located load and generator will pay for that. So they're arguing that they will pay for it.
Who is arguing that?
The data centers and the generators.
It's like just out of the goodness of their heart, or is there actually
In
a
order
tariff
to
that-
do, I don't believe there's a tariff. This is part of the overall current discussion around this. So the official rules are still being figured out, but that is part of the argument for why they say you should not get in the way of this. But
what would be the mechanism that we would be sure that would happen, given that there's
tariff or a final signed agreement.
that is if FERC changes the rules. But if nobody changes the rules between now and forever, right now, as the rules currently stand, would they be paying?
It depends on what happens when they sign I will call it an agreement.
With whom?
Between PJM and the generator / load, and get that approved by FERC. So what's been happening is that PJM has been entering into these special agreements with the generators and the load to say, I'm going to allow this arrangement, and they have a special contract that explains everything, and they go to FERC to get that approved. FERC has so far ruled on one of them and said you didn't meet your burden of proof yet, and they kicked it back, and I know that's still under litigation. And so that is what they're currently doing in terms of, but there's also at least two competing, diametrically opposed other, I would say, trying to actually get to tariff changes, which would be more like universal rules of the road, coming between the generators and the transmission owners saying don't allow this type B arrangement, generators saying allow it, to codify the rules. And so that's what's going to be happening even away from what we will do over these 90 days.
And so I guess,
I just want to say, but we don't really need the help of FERC or PJM to do that ourselves, to mandate that as part of what we ask.
Well, and
I
the
think
problem
that-
is, we don't control FERC, and cost causation.
and we don't control PJM.
Well, but cost causation has been a challenge since, I've been doing this for more than 40 years. And as much as you think you've solved the issue around cost causation at FERC, then they change the rules. So I don't know that we actually have a clear sense of who's going to pay if a data center goes off grid and then.
But I believe we can.
Right.
I think that's why, and I just want to
Right,
make
but
sure.
if I could add one more Delegate
Yes, that's the
Charkoudian to the mix, it's not just building out new transmission.
Oh, I
It's
know.
also finding the generation.
I know. I was trying to
And-
simplify,
And so
yes.
that's, so then you're going to you're going to build out transmission that's going to impose cost on customers, and then you don't have any assurance that you've got the necessary generation to
100%.
replace that.
And I think folks know that I spend a lot of time trying to change PJM. But that's a tough go of it. And I think that it's our responsibility as Maryland lawmakers to control everything that we can, because we don't have reason to trust PJM. At this point, they've put us in a resource adequacy mess. They've put us in a ratepayer mess, a capacity market disaster. And so I just think that, I hope that my colleagues and I will not hope for the best at FERC and, trust them, because I don't think we have reason to do that. I mean, we can hope for the best, but I think we shouldn't trust them to fix our problems. And I just want to highlight one other thing, if I could, that the other potential ratepayer impact, unless we change Maryland law, is that if they're on the front of or unless we clarify Maryland law, this is a question, this is my understanding of it, but I just want this confirmed. Unless we clarify Maryland law otherwise, it's possible that all of the things that everyone in front of the meter pays for, like their contribution to utility assistance, right? People pay EUSP on their bills, and so potentially a data center that goes behind the meter, not on the grid, is not going to contribute to utility assistance that every other electric customer in the state contributes to, unless we change the law to clarify that. And there's other things like that in power and RECs and everything else. Is that correct?
In one of the appendices to the report, we've actually sort of listed out a number of concerns related to that, and that is one of the ones that, apart from the cost causation that you impose on the system from just using electricity, all these other sort of ancillary charges that everybody else pays as being an electric customer, theoretically, these people wouldn't if they have this direct contractual relationship, unless we make some changes. And that's a Maryland situation, not a national
Yeah, it's a
thing.
complete Maryland.
And can I just add one thing too? Just one of the things we're doing at the organization at PJM States is really trying to get the information, because we need the information from PJM. We need to, when they do their necessary studies, have some transparency and understanding what's going into them, so that we truly understand all the costs of the of a Type B situation. Because right now we find that there's, I guess, lack of transparency.
So to clarify, you think more transparency at PJM would be a good thing?
We absolutely need that.
How about on votes and decision-making as well?
All across the board, but I think in this specific area, this is one that recently OPSI just wrote to PJM asking for, again, in their 4R report, and just understanding, so we, again, get a full picture, which we really don't have right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Doug Charkoudian, again, thank you for, I mean, this clarification. Now, also the wonderful cross-examination, very short, the yes or no questions get right to where you need them to go. So I'm guilty of doing it all the time, so I do appreciate that. So I think you have one last line of questions from Delegate Weibel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know about you guys, but it seems like things were a lot easier prior to deregulation, but you can comment on that if you like, but that's not my question. So when we were at PJM, obvious that there's a supply versus demand issue. Demand side management programs have kind of run their course. They've been very effective, but now we're seeing where the demand is actually increasing, not just at these data centers, but everywhere. So I guess my question is, it's my understanding that you all do have the authority to authorize construction of a regulated generation facility in Maryland, because we net import, is it 40% or 60% of our electricity?
Right.
So what are the prospects for baseload, reliable baseload generation? Because my understanding, the windmills and the solar panels aren't always on, and therefore they're not effective baseload generation like nuclear is. So are there any prospects for baseload, reliable baseload generation to be built in Maryland, so we're not building all of these transmission lines to bring electricity in from other sources outside the state?
So there's no proposal in front of us by anybody that we currently regulate to construct a generation facility either fossil, I mean, we obviously have the renewable ones that are in the queue to be constructed. But under the 1999 law that broke up the electric system and we moved away from one company that generated electricity, transmitted it, and distributed it to now separate entities, there is a provision in there that allows the local distribution companies to construct a generation facility if it's needed to support what's known as standard offer service, which is the electricity that the utilities provide to customers who decide not to shop for electricity. And so under the provisions of that, theoretically, some proposal could be made by one of the local companies to construct a generation facility to supply standard offer service. But no one has stepped forward yet and filed any application for a CPCN, which is what they'd have to get, which is the normal process that we go through to authorize the construction of a power plant. Now, that could happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And I guess, you know, part of the issue is, I mean, we always talk about, you know, all of the above. You know, we should have all sources of generation that's provided. And I kind of think that actually should be broadened in the sense of all the above should include all the options on the demand side. So we ought to be doing the things that we can do to lower electricity use and make it more efficient and take advantage of new technologies like storage and things like that. I mean, we're in a situation where, unlike, you know, the old days when you literally had to make the electricity that you used at that particular time, we now theoretically have a situation where we can make electricity during one part of the day and use it in a different part of the day. But on the other hand, you know, we've talked about all the generation sources, but we've historically tended to put all our eggs in one basket. You know, for a long time, you know, after the Arab oil embargo, I mean, we used to actually generate electricity by burning oil. And with the Arab oil embargo, they moved all the power plants off of that, and that's when coal plants came online. Coal plants created a different sort of process, so we now move to natural gas, which had been a limited supply, but now that seems to be a much larger supply of that. So now all the emphasis is sort of focused on that, but there are concerns about all of the fossil plants as their impact on the environment and the contribution they make to climate change. So now the look is to try to figure out a way to generate electricity through sources that don't necessarily contribute to the climate change problem. But I guess what I'm saying is we need to have all those options on the table right now, and let's let the process play out as to what we wind up using to supply the electricity. You know, the current process is theoretically designed that the demand for electricity that PJM figures out as part of their process and their planning and all that would incentivize the private sector to provide those resources, whether they're power plants or new technologies or things like that. I think the problem is there's been sort of a disconnect between the two, so that the market signals that should be coming from PJM through their design of their auctions for electricity aren't necessarily providing the right signal. And then the other problem is the process that PJM goes through to incorporate new facilities, whether they're renewable or fossil, into the grid has its own problems that they're trying to work through. So the process theoretically makes sense, but it's practically not working.
Yeah, can I just add to that? What he,
Well, wait, and I'm only because I know my colleagues have a very short amount of time to the next one. If you guys have comments, if you could make them concise,
Just quickly,
please.
there are a lot of resources, energy resources that are bottlenecked right now in the PJM queue. They're ready to go, or at least they've been proposed. We don't know exactly where they are, but until PJM clears those resources, and a lot of them are significant, I think there's 3 to 5 gigawatts of energy in that in that queue. So if we could just get them through the queue,
So that's
it's possible those could
Question
actually,
then, what can the state of Maryland do to incentivize that generation to be constructed or released? I mean, I think people aren't constructing because they're not going to get cost. A regulated utility is not going to build
Well,
a
they
baseload
also just
generation
can't
because
build
they
in
feel they're
the-
not going to get cost recovery, right?
They just can't get
So, and natural gas is a viable option. I know we all have differences of opinion on that, but we have a lot of closed power plants in the state, and it just seems like we could somehow convert those to natural gas and you know, solve that supply problem. But I'd be interested if any of you guys, you know, have any ideas on what we can do to incentivize those projects to move forward.
Just to conclude, as I mentioned, in one of the appendices to the official report that we filed in December is a list of specific legislative items that the committee should consider, and we're obviously willing to work with the committee staff on if you decide to go forward with any of those ideas.
I was going to say, I believe they've already addressed some of that in their report, so make sure you get a copy. So some of the things you're discussing have been addressed in your report. We have two very brief questions, one from Delegate Ahrens.
We were talking about generation stuff. The second from the end, you mentioned that we have a lot of projects in the tilt right now.
In the queue,
What's
yes.
stopping them?
Well, the first is just that they have not given interconnection rights by PJM. And that's not expected to happen until, 2028, 2030. And so there is an effort at PJM to recognize that and try to identify certain projects that could be moved up in the queue, but there are still a lot of problems there. And but again,
PJM says they're ready to go. They've approved 30 sites, 30 locations for generation, and they're saying they're not happening. And I was told maybe it's because the cost of RECs isn't high enough. Is that possible?
We'd have to look at each one of those to find out. But a lot of them have been waiting in the queue for some time, and so again, we'd have to see on a case-by-case situation what the issue is. But there are a lot of projects that are ready.
Okay, and PJM also said that they're actively pursuing natural gas right now. And Maryland has made a statement they don't want natural gas. When we asked about what they're doing for baseload, they're pursuing natural gas. How are we going to function in that world if we're going to be at 100% in the next 8 to 10 years?
Well, I mean, if a company wants to build a natural gas facility, all they have to do is file for CPCN, and we will evaluate whether or not that plant should be built and where it would go. So there's nothing in the current law that stops anybody from proposing building a natural gas power plant.
So you say Maryland's open to natural gas?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Last question. Thank you.
Oh.
All right, there we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quick question, since you opened it up. What is the status of, or lack thereof, of storage in the capacity markets? Like, where is that? I know that's been traditionally a very big challenge, and I'm curious as to, with everything we've done over the last couple of years, whether that's moved.
This legislature passed, it originally passed a pilot program, requiring us to examine the idea of storage technology. And then subsequent to that, legislation was passed to make storage permanent. So we actually are in the process of implementing that law. We've developed regulations that will, govern folks who want to create storage projects. So we have a number of those in the queue, and I'm actually pretty hopeful that that's going to become a significant piece of the puzzle. Because in a broader sense, I mean, we need to look at the fact that we now have the ability to sort of make electricity, store electricity, and use electricity all across the grid, and it all can be integrated because of the digital technology, and we just need to take advantage of those situations so that hopefully the amount of electricity we actually need will start to go down, even with the introduction of things like data centers, because we're now taking advantage of everybody's ability to make and store and use electricity.
Right. Okay. That's. I know I've been looking at Vermont and particularly Hawaii, and they've got great programs that are doing wonderfully. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Colleagues, thank you guys very much for the presentation, and I think we've got a lot out of it. I know this is an important issue, so thank you for the questions, and the knowledgeable response, and I'm sure that we'll be back in touch because there's a lot more to discuss. Thank you guys very much. And remember, guys, you're dismissed till 1:30. Please be back for our next briefing. Thank you. Grab something to eat.